All right, what's up, everyone, and welcome back to this special episode of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. I say it's a special episode because this one episode is going to be devoted to one issue and one issue alone, and that is to have our podcast offer and contribute something to the discussion happening around the events in Israel and Palestine right now. I was telling Brian before we jumped on the phone, before we jumped on this Zoom call, I certainly don't consider myself any type of expert or historian on the issue relating to Israel and Palestine. But from what I'm seeing in the news, from what I'm seeing in my feeds, I felt compelled to offer something. Hopefully, people will listen and consider some of what we're talking about here. Before I jumped on the call, before we jumped on and started recording, I was telling Brian how the issue of Israel was first presented to me as such. I was told that after World War II and after the Holocaust, uh, Jewish people from Germany had nowhere to go. So Israel was offered as a promised land. And that's where my understanding of Israel began. And the same person who gave me this understanding also told me that there were people there already. They were the Palestinians. And so I was telling Brian before we jumped on, that to me, right off the bat, seems like a contradiction, to have these displaced people go and displace other people. That just didn't seem like justice was served for anyone, honestly. So we started talking about it, and I mentioned that, and I also mentioned some of the popular myths that we could debunk on this show and speak to just a little bit. And I have to say that one of the popular myths that's out there is that this is a conflict that goes back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and that we shouldn't even attempt to untangle this conflict because it goes back so far and it's so complicated. And I don't believe that. I don't believe that. Along with recording this show, tonight I will also be posting an image of what Palestine looked like in 1947 and what it looks like now, and what land was taken by the Zionists who arrived at Palestine. And this image is shares space with a map of the United States. And it's a map that starts in 1492 and ends more recently. And basically, you see the same thing happen. The indigenous population of that land being displaced by force. And I think those are important maps to look at. And I think 1947 is an important date to consider because that's when this displacement started. And so if we look at 1947, that starts to tell us the history of a people who have been displaced, a people who have been oppressed, a people who have been displaced and put into refugee camps. These refugee camps, Gaza is the size of two Washington, D.C.s, and it's one of the most highly concentrated populations on this planet. So to watch Israel drop bombs on Gaza, that those aren't military targets. That's not quote unquote just Hamas that they're hitting. When you're firing missiles, and these are missiles that are provided by the United States, because the United States provides $4 billion in military aid to Israel every year. 4 billion, B with a B, $4 billion in military aid to Israel alone. And that's what pays for those missiles. That's what pays for the guns of the Israeli Defense Forces. That's what pays for stuff like Iron Dome. This in comparison to the Palestinian people, we don't even have to dig too far. The own bourgeois media admits that the Palestinian people have no standing army. The Palestinian people have no standing navy. The Palestinian people have no standing air force. The people that you see picking up arms are defending themselves against generations of apartheid style oppression. The people that you see picking up guns are standing up to defend and liberate themselves from generations of having their land taken, from generations of having bulldozers take down their homes. You don't see Palestinian bulldozers taking down Israeli homes. This is not a quote unquote fair fight, as I'm seeing even some of my friends post. This is not a fair fight. This doesn't even come close. And I understand that some folks try to present these fighters for liberation under a negative light because some of them may include a battle cry that may contain, some kind of religious message or something like that. And I personally I can't hate on that. They are first and foremost trying to liberate themselves, be it Hamas, be it the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or any other grouping that may have happened. And I use the word grouping very intentionally because it's not an army, it's not a standing army. So we needed to highlight that all on this show because the events that are happening in Israel and occupied Palestine really, they may change the course of history. They certainly affect us all in our soul. But I think, and we think, that it's important to understand exactly what kind of violence is happening there. The violence carried out by a fighter for liberation is not the same thing as the violence carried out by an occupying force or an occupying entity. As Leon Trotsky said, a slave owner who through cunning and violence shackles a slave in chains, and a slave who through cunning or violence breaks the chains, let not the contemptible eunuchs tell us that they are equals before a court of morality. In other words, the violence of a slave is not the same violence as the violence of a slave owner. The violence of a slave trying to liberate themselves, that's not the same violence of an oppressor. And I think that's something that needs to be distinguished here. Another thing that I think needs to be distinguished is the difference between the Jewish community and Zionists. And I think that's something that's glaringly missing in some of the stuff in my social media. And of course, in the bourgeois media. They're not the same thing. A Zionist is a settler. A Zionist uses apartheid to maintain those settlements. That's not the same thing as a Jewish person. And I think that when Zionists are receiving $4 billion a year in military aid alone, and they try to wrap themselves in the cloak of Judaism, man, not only does it disorient people, but again, this is a conflict that can change the course of world history. So we have to be very careful as to who we're talking about. And I think that making the distinction between the Zionists and Jews is critical. So I think those are some of the more important things that I would like to contribute to this conversation and understanding of the conflict that's taking place. For me, I had to do a lot of soul searching before coming out and making any kind of statement, but I couldn't let it go. I couldn't let it go because my soul couldn't let it go. It pains me to see the things that are happening to the Palestinian people, but also because as a person of Salvadoran descent, one of the freedom fighters in my country, one of the leaders of the FMLN, of the Liberation Front in my country during the 80s, one of the leaders was Shafiq Handal of Palestinian descent. And I, as a Salvadoran person, in my late 40s now, who saw this, who saw the war in my own country, and who some of the leaders were for the liberation forces, I've had to process this, and I've had to understand the international nature of a struggle for liberation. And I've had to wrap myself around the lessons of internationalism that Shafiq Handal left for myself, for Salvadorans, and the rest of the world. And I wouldn't feel right being quiet on this issue and not speaking wholly to it. And one of the reasons that I'm speaking on this issue is because of Shafiq Handal and because of the lessons that Shafiq Handal and other fighters for liberation offered me from El Salvador and from Palestine. Folks, you consider the types of governments and the types of entities that the United States supports. You consider the oligarchs and the military dictatorships in El Salvador. You consider the fascists in Brazil. You consider the fascists and the military dictatorships in Chile, the fascists in Guatemala. You start to take inventory of the types of governments and the types of ruling classes, the types of tyrants, the types of barbarism that the United States government has upheld around the world. And if you tease that out all the way and take it out of Latin America, and you apply that same understanding and that same inventory around the world, well, you start to see the real nature of entities like the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And you start to understand, oh, yeah, no, they're supporting fascists in Ukraine. Those aren't people who are fighting for democracy. And when you apply that same lens and you take that inventory and you look at Israel, no, that's not democracy that the United States is supposedly upholding there. You don't uphold democracy with $4 billion in military aid that aims and turns its guns on a refugee camp with the most densely populated population on the planet that also is like 50% below the age of 15. I'm sorry, but we're offering this particular episode to contribute to this discussion and bring something else to this discussion, because I'm not seeing this. I'm not seeing an acknowledgement that Palestine doesn't have a standing army, navy, or air force. They have rocket launchers, which at best can damage a building. Yeah, one of these missiles that's fired by Israel can level an entire city block. So it's not the same fight. And although I understand that some people want to give their condolences to the Jewish people, and I do too, we can't present this as a conflict between Jewish people and Palestinians, or Jewish people and Hamas, or anything like that. No, this is the product of the settler colonialism apartheid of Zionists. This is the product of $4 billion per year in military imperialist aid from the United States. And we just wanted to chime in and offer our listeners something to consider on this conflict.
On September 21st, the resolution was passed at the UE's National Convention calling for the United States to end the military aid to Israel. The UE is a United Electrical Workers Union, citing the urgent need to end the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the siege of Gaza. The resolution was titled "For Jobs, Peace, and a Pro-Worker Foreign Policy." The resolution also calls for reduction of the U.S. military budget and end to sanctions on Venezuela and steps toward a world free of nuclear weapons. The 78th UE Convention, which was held in Pittsburgh, demands the U.S. government end all military aid to Israel. And the UE went on to state it's not military invasion that people in the US are most endangered by, but rather the failure to provide living wage jobs, affordable health care, education, housing, and necessary social services as human rights, the resolution states. We are duty bound as workers here in the belly of the imperialist beast, the biggest imperialist machine that has ever existed in world humanity, that is funding Israel, that is sending ships and fighter jets to attack the Palestinians in occupied territory in historic Palestine. And we stand in solidarity with Palestinians in Palestine as well as the diaspora around the world and uphold the right to return here at We Rise Fighting. Furthermore, as Rick was stating, the lies and the tropes and the outright fabrications by the United States goes back to the actual founding, so-called, we would say, colonialism of the US of setting up Israel in 1947-48. We can never forget the Al-Nakba, which expelled, terrorized, murdered, and assassinated thousands of Palestinians out of their historic homeland. And one of the most diabolical lies of the US is that they did not participate in repelling Jewish people that were under siege by the Holocaust and trying to find refuge. They were actually on ships coming to the United States, and the United States repelled them from coming to the United States and turned the ships around under military guard to create the colonial outpost of Israel in the Middle East after the United States took over as the number one imperialist power over Britain in 1947 after World War II. This is the reality. Israel was set up as a garrison outpost settler state for big oil and primarily, but also for diplomatic, political, and other reasons, to essentially pacify their goal, to pacify, in some of their words, some of the worst war criminals' words, the Middle East, and to have an outpost in that region of the world to oppress and terrorize all Arab and Muslim and also progressive Christians and any other workers, socialist parties, communist parties from uprising against any oppressive activities by colonial actors, neo-colonial actors, and their masters such as Britain, France, the US, and others in the West. This is the history, and there's much more to it. We don't have time to go into depth on this show, but this is an important narrative and important to understand today's developments. And there are many labor organizations besides the United Electrical Workers internationally in this country, around the world, that are opposing the apartheid in historic Palestine by Israel with the US complicity, of course. And this includes in South Africa. Yesterday, there was a press conference by the ANC, the African National Congress, denouncing the US complicity in the US funding of Israel and the massacres and assassinations that are happening in the outright genocide. Also, the World Federation of Trade Unions has issued statements and has started another campaign to support Palestine. And the World Federation of Trade Unions from the beginning has supported the Palestinians. Of course, in Venezuela and Cuba, China has issued statements. Many other countries and labor unions around the world are engaging in solidarity with Palestine and all Palestinian people. What we're seeing today we're seeing many relief agencies, even the United Nations and others, who are releasing statements that what we're seeing before us right now at this very second is an outright genocidal massacres. Israel is refusing food, water, and electricity. This has been going on now for 8 days or more. So beyond the outright bombings that kill people immediately, hospitals are being leveled. Israel mentioned or issued a so-called directive that some are worried about a second Al-Nakba to force 1.1 at least million Palestinians from the north in Gaza to the south. And immediately upon entering the roads, Israel, with the full complicity of the United States, started to bomb ambulances and cars, slaughtering children and their families. This is outright genocidal activity and must be denounced before the whole world. And here we Rise Fighting, we stand with those in Palestine and those who are denouncing these crimes against humanity. And most importantly, since we here in the United States live in the United States, denounce President Joe Biden, who calls himself a Zionist, and the US sending money and munitions and guns and fighter ships, while here in this country, as we speak, student loans are being enacted. All the pandemic safety nets are gone. Children are literally being starved. The hot school lunches for children are being pulled after the pandemic, after the safety nets. And the US has the gall to lecture the world about human rights and democracy, while tens of millions of people in this country can barely live, while gentrification, talk about displacement, the displacement of Black and brown, and even poor white people here in the United States. They can't even afford to live in most urban centers in this country. The United States has no right at all to speak about democracy and human rights. And in fact, they're the greatest violator of human rights, as Dr. King said numerous times. We must end poverty, racism, and war. And we in labor have a duty to do this. There are many examples. We here at We Rise Fighting have reported on how the Italian workers refused to load ships to go to Israel and attack the Palestinians about a year ago. We have talked about the international longshore workers who refused to pack ships, load ships for apartheid South Africa munitions and supplies. Workers are absolutely essential to shutting down what is happening in Gaza as we speak, and historic Palestine and in the West Bank. We are also in solidarity with the many different demonstrations that are happening across this country. And right now, this is the utmost important activity to hit the streets. There was 10,000 yesterday that took to the streets or more in New York City. In the coming days, there are demonstrations all across the country, protest rallies, contacting your Congress people to tell them to stop supporting and enacting apartheid and genocide and giving our taxpayer money to massacre Palestinians is absolutely essential. And just as important or more important is to hit the streets in the tens of thousands and the millions to shut down what's happening and to demand an end to the US and Israel's apartheid in historic Palestine. We will be reporting here at We Rise Fighting on these developments. You can see on our Facebook page already that we have been supporting various different labor unions putting out statements, including the World Federation of Trade Unions that we have talked about here, the UE statement, and many others. We here as workers and on this podcast stand with Palestine, oppose apartheid, oppose genocide, and lastly, as Brother Rick stated, one of the most important lessons of the struggle of the people's struggle is understanding which side we stand on. If there are politicians around the United States that have every single step, every single thing they have done their entire political life has been against the working people of the state, supporting union busting, supporting attacks against women, supporting attacks against the LGBT community, and on and on. If they are getting up and supporting Israel, we should know which side of the class barricades we are on. And this is a test of where we stand today. And this is a tipping point, we believe, in this country. There are many more today. The youth are leading the charge in supporting Palestinian struggles. And we support groups like Jewish Voices for Peace, who are doing very important work in explaining what Brother Rick just said, that being pro-Palestinian is not being anti-Jewish. The critique is against Zionism. The critique is against imperialism, colonialism, apartheid, genocide. This must end. And that's where we stand. And the oppressed, even under international law, we looked it up. The United Nations Human Rights Charter and other United Nations language upholds the right of colonized and neo-colonized people to resist their oppression by any means necessary, up to and including armed self-defense. The Palestinian people have the right to their own representatives based on self-determination and democracy and democratic methods. The U.S. and Israel have no right to tell the Palestinian people who their representatives should be and how they, or any leftist forces, how the Palestinians should prosecute their struggle. That is a right that rests with the Palestinians, and we support their just struggle, whatever they and however they decide to do that based on the Palestinian people's historic democratic trajectory of resisting imperialism and apartheid.